The siege of Minas Tirith had reached its breaking point. Stone crumbled beneath the weight of war. Fire painted the sky in shades of amber and ash. The horns of Rohan echoed across the Pelennor fields, but above it all, perched upon the shattered gates of the White City, stood the Witch-King of Angmar. His blade gleamed with cold malice. His crown, invisible yet felt by all who looked upon him, radiated ancient power. Before him stood Gandalf the White, staff raised, light gathering at its tip like a defiant star against the encroaching dark. They had stood like this before, across centuries and battlefields, locked in the eternal dance between shadow and flame. But this moment felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The Witch-King raised his Morgul blade, ready to strike down the wizard who had haunted his master's plans for so long. Words of power began to form on lips that had not truly lived for thousands of years. But then, something changed. Far to the east, at the heart of Mordor, Sauron's tower collapsed. The One Ring had been destroyed. The Dark Lord's scream tore through every shadow, every corrupted corner of Middle-earth. But for the Nazgûl, the 9 who were bound to Sauron's will by rings of power, that scream was not merely sound. It was the unraveling of their very existence. The Witch-King felt at first a sensation like being pulled apart at the seams of reality itself. His essence, tethered to Sauron's for millennia, suddenly snapped loose. And in that moment of cosmic severance, something far worse than death awaited. The sky above Minas Tirith split open. Not with the red of fire or the black of smoke, but with colors that had no name in the tongue of elves or men. Gandalf staggered backward, his eyes wide with an expression the Witch-King had never seen on the wizard's face before, not fear, but incomprehension. The Witch-King himself looked up at the wound in reality and understood nothing. This was not Sauron's sorcery. This was not even the deep magic of the world's foundation. This was something else entirely. Tendrils of impossible light and shadow reached down from the tear, wrapping around the Witch-King like the fingers of some vast cosmic hand. He tried to resist, drawing upon centuries of necromantic power, upon the weight of his curse and the strength of his will. But it meant nothing. The world of Middle-earth began to fade, growing distant and dreamlike. He saw Gandalf shouting something, saw the wizard's staff blazing with desperate light, but the sound reached him as if from across an ocean. Then even that vanished. He fell through a void that was not empty. Faces pressed against him from all sides, faces that screamed and laughed and wept all at once. Voices whispered promises and threats in languages that predated language itself. Time lost all meaning. He might have fallen for seconds or centuries. The curse that bound him, that made him neither living nor dead, suddenly felt like the only anchor preventing him from dissolving entirely into this madness. When he finally crashed into something resembling solid ground, the Witch-King found himself in a realm that made Mordor look like a pleasant garden. The sky churned with colors that hurt to perceive. The ground beneath him was not earth or stone, but something that felt alive, pulsing with malevolent awareness. In the distance, if distance even existed in this place, vast shapes moved through storms of unreality. They were larger than mountains, more terrible than any dragon, and they turned their attention toward him with interest that felt like knives scraping across his ancient soul. Demons. He did not know that word yet, but he recognized predators when he saw them. Lesser entities began to circle, things made of spite and hunger and emotions given physical form. They sensed something unusual in him, not mortal flesh, not truly undead, not born of this realm of madness. Something that carried the scent of a different darkness altogether. They approached cautiously, like wolves uncertain whether they had cornered prey or stumbled upon something far more dangerous. The Witch-King rose to his feet. His armor, forged in the pits of Mordor, remained intact. His blade, blessed with Sauron's malice, still hummed with cold power. But Sauron was gone, unmade, destroyed, and yet the Witch-King remained. The curse that had bound him for so long, no living man may hinder me, had not vanished with his master's fall. If anything, torn loose from its original context and cast into this realm of pure chaos, the curse had become something stranger still. Something these circling horrors could sense but not comprehend. One of them lunged, all teeth and claws and impossible angles. The Witch-King's blade met it mid-strike, and the demon recoiled, shrieking. Where the Morgul's steel touched it, the creature's essence didn't merely wound it, corrupted in ways that even demons found abhorrent. The others pulled back, chittering and hissing in their maddening tongues. They had expected easy prey. They had found something else entirely. The Witch-King stood in the Immaterium, though he did not know its name. He stood in the realm of chaos, though he had never heard those words spoken. But he recognized one truth with absolute certainty: he was not in Middle-earth anymore. This was a new hell, a new darkness. And somewhere in the eternal malice that had sustained him for thousands of years, something that might have once been called ambition began to stir. If he could not return to his old master, perhaps this new realm of madness would provide opportunities all its own. Time moved strangely in the warp, when it moved at all. The Witch-King wandered through landscapes that changed with each step, through architectures built from screams and mathematics that denied sanity. Lesser demons learned quickly to avoid him. Word spread through the Immaterium in the way that rumors spread through a fever dream, distorted but carrying essential truth. There was something walking the warp that did not belong, something that the realm itself could not fully digest. The Witch-King found the madness almost comforting. He had spent millennia as a wraith, existing between life and death, sustained by dark sorcery and bound to rings of power. His perception of reality had long since diverged from anything a mortal mind could comprehend. The warp's constantly shifting nature, its denial of physical laws, its embrace of nightmare logic, all of it felt oddly familiar, like returning to a home he had never known he had. The screaming winds that drove lesser beings to insanity whispered to him in tones that almost made sense. But the warp was not empty of rulers. The chaos gods, those vast and terrible consciousnesses born from the galaxy's darkest emotions, had noticed the intruder. They watched him with interest that ranged from curiosity to hunger to cold calculation. Each reached out in their own way, testing this strange entity that walked their realm without permission or purpose. Khorne's attention came first, as it always did. The blood god had little patience for subtlety. Reality around the Witch-King suddenly shifted, and he found himself standing in an arena of brass and bone, surrounded by an infinite colosseum filled with screaming spectators made of living rage. Before him stood a bloodthirster, one of Khorne's greatest champions, a demon of such physical might that it could tear apart tanks with its bare hands. The creature roared a challenge that shook the very fabric of the warp. The Witch-King regarded it with the cold detachment of someone who had faced Balrogs in the depths of time. The bloodthirster charged, and the battle was joined. For what might have been hours or heartbeats, they clashed demon fury against ancient necromancy, raw strength against calculated malice. When it ended, the bloodthirster lay broken, its essence dissipating back into the warp, and the Witch-King stood untouched. The Colosseum fell silent. Khorne's interest curdled into frustration. This was not a warrior seeking glory through blood. This was something colder, something that killed without passion or hate. The blood god turned his attention elsewhere, dismissing the Witch-King as unworthy of further notice. Tzin came next, as he inevitably did when Khorne failed. The architect of fate prided himself on his subtlety, on his ability to see patterns and possibilities that others missed. The Witch-King found himself walking through a library of infinite dimensions, where books wrote themselves and knowledge whispered from every shadow. A lord of change materialized before him, all eyes and wings and knowing smiles. It offered secrets, the way back to his world, the path to ultimate power, the answers to questions the Witch-King had not thought to ask. But the Witch-King had been tempted before, by Sauron himself, by the ring of power he had once accepted. He knew the taste of honeyed lies. More importantly, he recognized that these secrets came with strings attached, with alterations to his very being that would transform him into something he was not. The demon's smile faltered when the Witch-King simply turned and walked away, leaving the infinite library behind. Tzin's laughter followed him, but it held notes of uncertainty. Here was a mind that could not be reshaped, a fate that refused to follow the expected paths. Nurgle's embrace came more gently, as it always did. The Plague Lord did not threaten, or tempt he welcomed. The Witch-King suddenly found himself in a garden of extraordinary beauty, if one could look past the rot and decay that sustained it. Diseases bloomed like flowers. Plagues danced through the air like butterflies. And at the center of it all sat Nazgûl himself, vast and content and eternally cheerful. He offered the Witch-King a place in his garden, a role in his great cycle of entropy and renewal. After all, was not the Witch-King already a thing of decay? Was he not already beyond life and death? Why not embrace it fully and find peace in decomposition? But the Witch-King was not decayed. He was preserved, held in stasis by curses and sorcery, unchanging and eternal. Nazgûl's gifts offered transformation through rot, but the Witch-King had no interest in transformation of any kind. He wanted to remain exactly what he was. The Plague Lord sighed with something almost like genuine sadness and let him go. Of all the Chaos gods, Nazgûl might have been the closest to understanding what the Witch-King truly was, a thing frozen in time, refusing to move forward or backward, existing in eternal defiance of natural law. Slaanesh came last, and perhaps most dangerously. The Prince of Pleasure did not appear as a single entity, but as 1,000 different sensations, each promising something the Witch-King had lost when he became one of the 9. The warmth of sunlight on skin, the taste of wine, the touch of another living being. All the experiences that mortality offered, distilled into pure sensation and offered without limit or consequence. For just a moment, something deep within the Witch-King's cursed existence stirred a memory of the man he had been before the ring, before Sauron, before everything. But that memory was buried under 3,000 years of undeath and malice. The Witch-King had sacrificed his humanity long ago, traded it willingly for power and immortality. Slaanesh's promises of restored sensation were meaningless to a being who no longer remembered why such things mattered. The Prince of Pleasure withdrew, perhaps more confused than the others. Here was a soul that felt nothing, wanted nothing, needed nothing except the cold certainty of its own continued existence. The Chaos gods conferred, in whatever way such vast beings communicated. The Witch-King could feel their attention upon him, like the weight of collapsing stars. They had all tried to claim him, to corrupt him, to add him to their endless legions, and all had failed. Not because he was strong enough to resist, though he was, but because he was fundamentally incompatible with their nature. They were born from emotion, from excess and despair and rage and hope twisted into dark mirrors. The Witch-King was born from a curse, from necromancy, from a dark lord who existed entirely outside this universe's metaphysical framework. He was, in the most literal sense, an alien presence in the warp. And that made him dangerous in ways the Chaos gods were only beginning to understand. They could not claim him, but neither could they easily destroy him. His curse, "No living man may hinder me," had evolved in this realm of pure psychic energy. Here, where belief and reality were the same thing, where concepts had physical form, an ancient prophecy from another world became something far stranger. The demons were not living, but they were not entirely unliving either. They were emotion given form, thought made manifest. And the curse, confused by entities that defied its original parameters, simply refused to let them fully affect him. The Witch-King continued his wandering through the warp, now marked by the attention of gods, but claimed by none. And as he walked, he began to understand where he was and what he had become. This was a realm of war and madness, of power and horror beyond anything Middle-earth had ever known. And he was free in a way he had never been before, no master to serve, no dark lord to command him, no destiny but what he chose to forge. The thought that might have once been called ambition grew stronger with each step. If this realm of chaos would not claim him, then perhaps he would claim it instead. The inquisitorial black ship Eternal Penance drifted through the void near the Cadian Gate, a fortress of ceramite and faith in the darkness between stars. Its holds were filled with psykers, chained and sedated, awaiting transport to Holy Terror, where they would fuel the Emperor's endless hunger or be trained to serve the Imperium in more useful ways. The Gela field hummed its protection against the warp, a bubble of reality imposed upon the screaming madness beyond. Everything was routine. Everything was as it should be. Until the astropaths began to scream. In the sanctum deep within the ship's heart, 5 astropaths sat in their communion circle, minds linked in the careful synchronization that allowed faster-than-light communication across the void. They were experienced navigators of the immaterium, having seen horrors that would drive normal humans mad. But what they sensed now was different. It was not the hot chaos of demon presence or the writhing corruption of warp storms. It was cold. Impossibly, terribly cold. A void within the void, an absence that felt like death itself had taken physical form. One astropath's nose began to bleed. Another started convulsing, his psychic voice screaming warnings that made no sense. Not alive, not dead, not of the warp, not of reality. Something wrong, something wrong. Captain Drusus of the Imperial Navy responded with practiced efficiency. He sealed the astropath chamber and called for the ship's master of the astropathic choir. He ordered full sensor sweeps of the surrounding void, looking for any anomaly that might explain the disturbance. And there, at the very edge of sensor range, the auger arrays detected something impossible, a heat signature, human-sized, floating in the void without a ship or void suit. No life support. No vessel. Just a single figure, suspended in vacuum where nothing living should survive. The debate among the ship's officers was brief but intense. Standard protocol demanded they report the anomaly and continue their mission. But they were near the Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality where the warp bled through into normal space. Any anomaly might be the precursor to something worse, a demonic incursion, a chaos warband, a threat to the Cadian Gate itself. Drusus made his decision. They would retrieve the figure, contain it in sanctified chambers, and investigate. If it proved dangerous, they had servitors, null shields, and enough bolt rounds to purge anything unholy. He believed this completely. The Witch-King drifted in the darkness between stars, and for the first time in his existence, he felt something approaching uncertainty. He had walked from the Eye of Terror into real space through sheer force of will and necromantic power, dragging his cursed essence across the boundary between warp and reality. But now he hung in a void utterly unlike the one between worlds in Middle-earth. This was true emptiness, no air, no light, no life. His undead nature meant he needed none of these things to persist, but even so, the absolute nothingness of the vacuum felt alien in ways the warp's madness had not. Then the vast shape of the black ship approached, and the Witch-King felt the minds within it thousands of thoughts, prayers, fears, and certainties. He felt the psykers in the hold, their powers bound and suppressed. He felt something else too, a presence that reminded him faintly of the elves' holy artifacts, a protective field of some kind, keeping the warp at bay. The ship extended mechanical arms, wrapped them around his armored form, and pulled him into an airlock. He allowed it. After wandering the immaterium's chaos, the Witch-King was curious about the material realm of this strange new universe. They placed him in a containment chamber blessed by prayers and inscribed with sigils of warding. Nullfield generators hummed, creating zones of psychic emptiness designed to neutralize any warp-based entity. Heavy bolters were mounted at 4 corners, their barrels aimed at the chamber's center. 100 servitors and armsmen stood ready, weapons prepared, prayers on their lips. And through thick armored glass, Captain Drusus and his officers watched as the Witch-King was laid upon a slab of cold metal. For a long moment, nothing happened. The medical servitors approached with scanning equipment, their mechanical eyes and sensors sweeping over the figure's ancient armor. They reported findings that made no sense: armor composition unknown, radiological signature null, heat signature present but irregular, biological signs completely absent. No heartbeat. No breath. No neural activity. Yet the sensors confirmed the figure had mass, had volume, had presence. It existed, but by every measure they possessed, it was not alive. Then the Witch-King sat up. The servitors stumbled backward, their mechanical reflexes unable to process what had just occurred. The armsmen raised their weapons, barking challenges in Gothic, demanding identification and compliance. Captain Drusus leaned forward against the observation glass, his enhanced eyes narrowing. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its helmeted head turning to survey the chamber. When it stood, its full height became apparent, taller than a normal man, clad in armor that was clearly ancient but bore no heraldry they recognized. No chaos symbols. No imperialaquilas. Nothing. The psychic sensors, designed to detect warp presence and rate demon corruption levels, showed readings that the tech priests couldn't interpret. There was something there, some force or energy, but it registered as neither warp-tainted nor clean. It existed in a category the machine spirits had no designation for. The null field generators seemed to affect it, but only partially, like trying to suppress something that was only half real to begin with. This should have been impossible. Everything in the Imperium's 10,000 years of fighting chaos had taught them that things were either of the warp or of reality. This entity appeared to be neither and both. An inquisitorial acolyte, Sister Karenina of the Order of the Bloody Rose, stepped forward to the communication vox. Her voice, amplified through speakers into the containment chamber, was hard and filled with righteous authority. In the name of the God Emperor of mankind, identify yourself, state your allegiance, submit to his judgment. The Witch-King tilted his head, the gesture almost curious. He heard the voice, understood it was a demand of some kind, but the language was utterly foreign. Gothic bore no relation to Westron or Sindarin or the Black Speech. Yet he recognized tone and intent. These were jailers, questioners, judges. He had dealt with such before, in the courts of men and the prisons of Gondor, back when he had been merely a king and not yet a wraith. Sister Karenina repeated her demand, this time with more force. When no response came, she nodded to the weapons operators. A single bolt shell was fired, a warning shot, aimed at the ground before the Witch-King's feet. The mass-reactive round exploded against the metal floor, sending shrapnel and consecrated fragments in all directions. It should have wounded, should have sent any mortal being reeling. The Witch-King merely looked down at the scorched metal, then back up at the observation window. And for the first time, they heard his voice sound like winter wind through a graveyard, like the last breath of a dying king, like the whisper of prophecy from a future best left unspoken. He spoke in a language none of them knew, but the meaning came through anyway, carried on the weight of his ancient curse and the psychic resonance that clung to him like grey frost. 3 words, each one settling into their minds despite the language barrier, making them understand through pure force of malevolent will. You are afraid. It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was an observation, spoken with the cold certainty of someone who had spent 3,000 years learning to recognize fear in all its forms. And as those words echoed through the containment chamber and into the minds of everyone watching, they realized with creeping horror that he was right. Despite all their weapons, despite their faith, despite the Emperor's protection and the ship's holy wards, they were terrified. Because standing before them was something their universe had no category for, no protocol to handle, no prayer to banish. The Witch-King of Angmar had arrived in the Imperium of man. And the Imperium had no idea what it had found. The first rumor started in the lower decks, whispered between ratings during shift change. A servitor had malfunctioned near the containment sector, its mechanical voice stuttering words that made no sense. The silent king walks, the cold one sees. No living man may stop him. The tech priests dismissed it as corrupted code and performed the proper rites of mechanical exorcism. But the rumor spread anyway, carried on the fearful voices of men and women who spent their days maintaining a ship that sailed between reality and nightmare. By the second day of the Witch-King's containment, 3 armsmen had requested transfer to other duties, claiming nightmares whenever they stood guard near the sanctified chamber. They dreamed of crowns made of shadow and blades that wept with cold poison. They dreamed of kingdoms that had fallen to darkness millennia before their births, of battles fought with sword and sorcery in a world their universe had never known. The ship's confessors heard their testimony and prescribed prayer and penance, but privately they grew concerned. These were not the usual nightmares that plagued those who traveled near the Eye of Terror. This was something different. Captain Drusus authorized a second series of tests. Sister Karenina led a team of Ministorum priests into the containment chamber, bearing holy relics and texts of the Imperial Creed. They chanted litanies of protection and faith, calling upon the Emperor's light to reveal any taint or corruption. The Witch-King watched them with what might have been amusement, though his helmeted face revealed nothing. When they sprinkled holy water blessed by a cardinal of the ecclesiarchy, it struck his armor and evaporated with a hiss, but not from heat from cold. The droplets froze in mid-air and shattered like tiny ice crystals. The priests recoiled. This was not how demons reacted to blessed water. Demons burned, screamed, recoiled in agony. This entity simply caused the holy symbol to fail, to freeze and die without apparent effort. Sister Karenina, to her credit, held her ground. "What are you?" she demanded, this time not with authority but with genuine desperate curiosity. "Demon? Xenos? Some creation of the Dark Mechanicum?" The Witch-King studied her through the empty sockets of his helm. He was beginning to understand fragments of their language, picking up meaning from repetition and context with the unnatural learning capacity of one who had mastered dozens of tongues in Middle-earth. He spoke again, this time in halting Gothic colored by an accent that sounded ancient beyond measure. "No, demon, not alive, no." Those 3 words, "not yours," sent a chill through everyone present that had nothing to do with the unnatural cold radiating from the entity. The Imperium of man claimed dominion over all of humanity, from the Golden Throne on Terra to the furthest edges of the galaxy. The very concept of something human-shaped that was not theirs touched on heresies that most Imperial citizens couldn't even articulate. Sister Karenina's hand moved unconsciously to the bolt pistol at her hip. By the 3rd day, the astropaths had composed messages to the nearest inquisitorial fortress, detailing the anomaly and requesting guidance. The responses came back fragmented and confused, as psychic communication across the warp often was, but the core message was clear. Contain the entity, prevent any escape, await the arrival of an Inquisitor Lord who could properly assess the situation. Estimated time of arrival: 3 weeks. Captain Drusus read the message and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. 3 weeks of keeping this thing locked in his ship's heart, while fear and rumor spread through his crew like a plague. The tech priests attempted one final test. They had constructed a servitor specifically programmed to approach the entity and perform a direct biological scan, something more thorough than remote sensors could provide. The servitor, barely human anymore, shuffled into the containment chamber and extended its augmented arms toward the Witch-King. For a moment, it seemed like it might succeed. Then the Witch-King reached out and touched it. The servitor collapsed instantly, not broken but simply stopped. Its mechanical components continued to function, motors whirring and hydraulics pumping, but the organic core went completely inert. When the tech priests recovered it for analysis, they made a discovery that sent waves of alarm through the ship's upper command. The servitor's biological components hadn't died. They had been preserved, frozen in the exact moment of contact, every cell intact but completely non-functional. It was like looking at a living being that had been turned into a 3-dimensional photograph present, detailed, but utterly without life or animation. This was when Captain Drusus decided that protocols had to be escalated. He authorized the use of terminal sanctions. If the entity proved too dangerous to contain, it would be destroyed. Never mind that it seemed unkillable, they would find a way. They always did. The armsmen were given new orders: prepare for execution. The execution chamber was prepared with extreme prejudice. Null-field generators were set to maximum output. Plasma coils were charged. Melter guns were blessed and loaded. A ministorum priest performed the rites of final judgment, calling upon the emperor to witness the destruction of a thing that should not exist. When the Witch-King was brought into the chamber walking calmly between a full squad of armsmen, chains blessed by the Cardinal of Cadia binding his armored wrists, he showed no sign of resistance or fear. Sister Karenina, standing at the observation window, found herself hesitating. There was something about the way the entity moved, the cold dignity in its posture, that reminded her of the ancient vids she had seen of the Emperor's own custards. Not in appearance, but in bearing the absolute certainty of purpose, the utter lack of fear in the face of death. She opened the Vox to say something, though she didn't know what. But Captain Drusus had already given the order. The melter guns fired first, thermal rays capable of reducing ceramite to molten slag. They struck the Witch-King dead center, and for a moment the entire chamber was filled with light so bright the observers had to shield their eyes. When the glare faded, there was nothing, no body, no armor, no sign that anything had ever stood there. Just scorched metal and the lingering smell of ozone. For exactly 10 seconds, everyone believed it had worked. Then the temperature in the chamber began to drop. Not gradually, but precipitously, falling from normal temperature to freezing to well below that in the space of heartbeats. Frost spread across the walls. The observer's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. And in the center of the chamber, where nothing should have remained, a shadow began to coalesce. The Witch-King reformed, not instantly but in a slow gathering of darkness and cold. His armor knit itself back together from wisps of shadow. His form solidified from the frigid air itself. Within 30 seconds he stood exactly as he had before, unmarked and unharmed. And then he did something that would haunt the nightmares of everyone present for the rest of their lives. He laughed. It was a soft sound, almost gentle, the kind of laugh a grandfather might give to a child's clumsy mistake. But carried within it was 3,000 years of death and darkness, of kingdoms fallen and heroes broken, of a curse so powerful that even complete annihilation could not end it. When he spoke, his Gothic was clearer now, learned through some dark mechanism none of them could understand. You cannot destroy what is already unmade. In the observation room, Captain Drusus stood frozen, his face pale. Sister Karenina's hand trembled on her bolt pistol. The tech priest's mechadendrites clicked in agitation, their logical systems failing to process what they had witnessed. And throughout the entire ship, from the bridge to the deepest holds, every human being aboard felt a primal terror settle into their bones. The Imperium of man had faced demons and Xenos, traitors and heretics, horrors from old night and nightmares from the warp. But this was something new. And as the reports began to filter up through proper channels, as astropathic messages burned through the warp toward inquisitorial fortresses and Ordo Malleus strongholds, a new name began to appear in classified documents and sealed reports. The Silent King. The Undying Wraith. The thing that should not be. The Witch-King of Angmar, standing alone in his frozen chamber, felt that old familiar sensation, power recognized, fear acknowledged, respect earned through terror. He may have lost his Dark Lord and his ring, but in this grim universe, perhaps he had found something even better. The opportunity to make even gods learn to fear. The warp storm hit the Eternal Penance on the 4th day after the Witch-King's failed execution, and it hit with the fury of gods offended. The Gellerfield held for the first 3 minutes a testament to the ship's holy construction and the prayers of its crew. Then reality began to hemorrhage. The astropaths felt it first. Their minds suddenly flooded with voices that screamed and gibbered and made promises that would have been tempting if they weren't so terrifying. They tried to raise the alarm, but some of them were already convulsing, blood streaming from their eyes as the warp pressed against their consciousness like a vice. Captain Drusus ordered all hands to battle stations, initiated full lockdown protocols, and sent desperate prayers to the Emperor that the Gellerfield would stabilize. It didn't. Across the ship, reality began to thin. Shadows moved against their source lights. Sounds echoed before they were made. A rating on the lower decks looked at his own hand and watched his fingers multiply into impossible geometries before his eyes, then felt them settle back into normal shape, leaving him uncertain whether he had imagined it. The ship's confessors moved through the corridors chanting protective litanies, but their voices sounded hollow against the weight of the warp's attention. The Chaos Gods had finally lost their patience. The Witch-King had walked their realms, rejected their offers, and then somehow crossed back into reality. Now he was contained on an Imperial vessel, being studied and potentially weaponized by the corpse worshippers who dared call themselves an empire. This was intolerable. If they could not claim the Witch-King for themselves, they would at least prevent the Imperium from having him. And if that meant destroying an entire black ship and the thousands of souls aboard it, the ruinous powers considered that an acceptable price. The Gellerfield failed completely in Section 7 Gamma, and demons poured through the breach like blood from a wound. Blood letters of Khorne came first, as they always did, howling their eternal rage and swinging hellblades that cut through bulkheads as easily as flesh. Behind them came pink horrors of Tazeen Che, cackling as they threw witchfire that burned with colors that shouldn't exist. Plague-bearers of Nazgûl shuffled through the corridors, their very presence causing metal to rust and air to foul. And whispering through it all came the demonettes of Slaanesh, beautiful and terrible, promising ecstasies that would drive sane minds to self-destruction. The ship's defenders responded with the fury of the faithful. Armsmen fired lasguns until the barrels melted. Sister Karenina and her battle sisters carved through demons with blessed power swords and bolt pistols loaded with sanctified ammunition. The servitors fought with mechanical precision, trading their worthless artificial lives to buy seconds for the humans behind them. And for a few glorious minutes, it seemed like they might hold. Then more breaches opened. More demons poured through. The ship was being torn apart from the inside. In his containment chamber, the Witch-King felt the warp's presence flood through the vessel and found himself almost nostalgic. This chaos, this overwhelming darkness, it reminded him of Mordor at the height of its power, when Sauron's armies had blotted out the sun and the very earth wept with corruption. The difference was that this chaos was undirected, random, a storm rather than a siege. The demons were not following a master plan. They were simply feeding, destroying, reveling in their nature. It lacked the elegant malice he had known in Middle-earth, but it had a certain brutal honesty that he could appreciate. The containment chamber's door exploded inward, blown apart by warp lightning. 3 bloodletters burst through, drawn by the sense of something powerful and ready to kill. They saw the Witch-King standing calmly in the center of the room, chains still wrapped around his wrists, and interpreted his stillness as weakness. The lead demon leaped forward, its hellblade raised for a strike that would cleave the Witch-King from crown to groin. The Witch-King's own blade was in his hand before the bloodletter finished its arc, though none who might have watched could say how it got there. The Morgul's sword met the hellblade with a sound like a scream dying in winter. For a moment, the 2 weapons were locked together, demon forged against Dark Lord blessed. Then something happened that the demon's limited consciousness couldn't process. The hellblade began to corrode, not with rust or decay, but with something worse. It was being negated, unmade, corrupted by a form of darkness that predated the chaos gods themselves. The bloodletter staggered backward, its weapon crumbling to ash in its claws. It opened its mouth to roar defiance, but the Witch-King was already moving. His blade carved through the demon's essence, and where it cut, the creature didn't just die, it suffered something worse than death. Its form came apart in ways that violated the warp's own twisted physics, unraveling into tatters of screaming energy that dissipated into nothing. No return to the warp. No reformation. Just ending, absolute and terrible. The other 2 bloodletters hesitated, which was not a thing creatures of Khorne typically did. They sensed something wrong, something their god had not warned them about. The Witch-King turned his empty gaze upon them and spoke a single word in the black speech, immortal tongue created by Sauron for the express purpose of commanding servants and breaking wills. The word meant nothing to the demons intellectually, but it carried with it such weight of ancient authority that they recoiled as if struck. Then the Witch-King screamed, and the warp itself recoiled. It was not a scream of pain or rage. It was the Nazgûl shriek, the black breath, the cry that had broken the courage of armies and driven kings to madness. But here, in a universe where psychic phenomena had physical force, where emotion and belief could shape reality, the scream became something more. It rippled out from the containment chamber like a wave of pure existential dread, passing through bulkheads and corridors and hitting every demon in the nearby sections. Lesser demons simply ceased to exist, unable to maintain cohesion in the face of such focused negation. Greater demons stumbled, their forms flickering as if they were bad-picked transmissions. The bloodletters in the containment chamber dissolved into ichor and essence, screaming their confusion and fear. And throughout the sections of the ship where the Witch-King's cry reached, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant, frost forming on walls and weapons and armor. The human defenders felt it too, a wave of terror so profound that some collapsed where they stood, their minds unable to process such concentrated horror. But they didn't die. They didn't corrupt. The cry wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the warp, at the demons, at the very concept of chaos itself. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. Sister Karenina, fighting 3 demonettes on a catwalk above the engine decks, felt the moment the demon's assault faltered. 1 second they were pressing her with inhuman speed and grace. The next they were pulling back, their perfect faces showing something that might have been confusion or fear. She didn't waste the opportunity, putting blessed bolt rounds through their skulls before they could recover. Around her, across all the sections near the containment chamber, the tide of the demonic assault was turning. The Chaos Gods, watching through the eyes of their servants, finally understood what they were facing. This entity, this Witch-King, wasn't just immune to their corruption. He was actively poisonous to it. His nature forged in a different universe's darkness, shaped by sorceries that predated the warp, bound by curses that operated on completely different metaphysical principles, made him anathema to them in ways that even the Emperor's light was not. Where the Emperor's power burned them with holy fire, the Witch-King simply caused them to come apart, to fail, to stop functioning like machines exposed to some incompatible force. Khorne roared his frustration, pulling his demons back from sections they had already conquered. Tsentij muttered calculations and prophecies that kept arriving at impossible results. Nurgle's cheerful demeanor cracked for just a moment, showing something that might have been actual concern. And Slaanesh, ever the most perceptive, whispered to the others what they were only beginning to realize. They had made a terrible mistake by forcing this confrontation. Better to have left the Witch-King to the Imperium. Better to have let the corpse worshippers try to contain him. Because now he knew his own strength in this universe, knew what he could do to the powers that claimed to rule it. The warp storm broke as suddenly as it had come, reality snapping back into place like a rubber band released. The Gellerfield re-established, blessed and whole, driving out the remaining demons in bursts of psychic fire. The ship's defenders stood amid the carnage, surrounded by the dissolving corpses of their enemies and their own fallen comrades, trying to process what had just happened. They had survived a demonic incursion that should have destroyed them utterly. And somehow, impossibly, the thing they had been guarding in the containment chamber had been their salvation. Captain Drusus made his way to the observation window overlooking the containment chamber, Sister Karenina limping beside him with a gash in her armor that wept blood down her side. They looked through the armored glass at the Witch-King, who stood exactly where he had been before the attack, his blade now sheathed, his posture calm. He turned his helmed head toward them, and though they couldn't see his face, they somehow knew he was looking directly at them. Sister Karenina found her voice first, barely a whisper. "What in the Emperor's name is he?" Captain Drusus could only shake his head, unable to form words. But in the depths of his heart, trained by decades of service to recognize threats and categorize dangers, one thought crystallized with terrible clarity. Whatever this entity was, wherever it came from, it was not something the Imperium could contain. They had tried to cage a force of nature, tried to imprison a nightmare that even chaos feared. And sooner or later, probably sooner, they were going to pay for that hubris. The Witch-King stood in his frozen chamber, alone and untouched, and for the first time since arriving in this universe, he allowed himself something approaching satisfaction. He had measured himself against the dark gods of this realm, and found them wanting. They could not claim him. They could not destroy him. They feared him. And fear, as he had learned over 3,000 years of undeath, was the foundation upon which all true power was built. The strike cruiser Blade of Titan translated back into real space with the controlled fury of a predator striking. It was a vessel of the Grey Knights, the Imperium's most secret and devastating weapon against demonic incursion, and it had been summoned by the astropathic screams from the Eternal Penance. On the bridge, Brother Captain Arvan Stern stood in his Terminator armor, his nemesis force weapon humming with barely contained psychic power. His mind was already reaching out, tasting the warp currents around the damaged black ship, analyzing the psychic residue of the battle that had taken place. What he found confused him, which was itself concerning. Very little confused a Grey Knight. The demon's presence was clear, their taint lingered like a stench on the immaterium. But there was something else, something his psychically attuned senses kept sliding off as if it didn't want to be perceived. It wasn't demon corruption, but it wasn't clean either. It existed in a category his training had no name for, and that made it dangerous in ways that exceeded mere physical threat. Brother Captain Stern ordered full combat deployment. Whatever was aboard that black ship, it would face the Emperor's finest and it would be purged. The boarding torpedoes hammered into the Eternal Penance's hull with surgical precision, breaching airlocks and depositing full squads of Grey Knights into the vessel's damaged corridors. They moved with the perfect synchronization of warriors who had trained together for decades, their psychic hoods glowing with contained power, their storm bolters tracking for threats that could come from any direction. Behind them came the Purifiers, elite even among the Grey Knights, their incinerators ready to burn away any taint they discovered. And at the center of it all strode Brother Captain Stern, his mind a fortress of faith and determination. Captain Drusus met them in the command deck with obvious relief. "Thank the Emperor you've come," he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "We've contained the entity in Section 12, but I don't know how much longer." "The entity is no longer contained," interrupted one of the Grey Knights, Brother Librarian Hyperion, his eyes glowing with psychic sight. "It walks." Indeed, the Witch-King had tired of his frozen chamber. When the warp storm had broken and the demons had fled, the ship's containment protocols had been damaged beyond function. The null field generators had burned out. The blessed wards had been scorched from the walls. And the chains that had bound him, forged from ceramite and sanctified by prayers, had frozen brittle in the unnatural cold his presence generated. He had simply walked through them, the metal shattering like ice, and now he wandered the Eternal Penance's corridors with the calm curiosity of a tourist in a foreign land. The ship's surviving crew scattered before him, not because he threatened them, but because his mere presence inspired such profound unease that standing near him felt like standing at the edge of a grave. He ignored them, more interested in the vessel's architecture, its strange technology, its fusion of religious iconography and brutal functionality. It reminded him, in some ways, of the fortresses of Numenor in their fallen days, grandiose and powerful, but built on foundations of fear and enforced compliance rather than genuine nobility. The Grey Knights found him on the observation deck, standing before a massive viewport that showed the wounded beauty of real space stars scattered like diamonds on velvet, nebulae glowing with colors no painter could capture. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture almost relaxed, like a noble admiring a tapestry. When the Grey Knights entered, weapons raised and psychic powers gathering like storm clouds, he didn't turn around. "I am Brother Captain Arvin Stern of the Grey Knights, the Emperor's holy blade against the demonic," Stern announced, his voice amplified by his armor's vox grill. "In his name, I command you to kneel and submit to judgment." The Witch-King finally turned, moving with liquid grace despite his heavy armor. He regarded the Grey Knights with what might have been interest. These warriors were different from the others he had encountered aboard this ship. They radiated power in a way that reminded him of the Astari, the wizards of Middle-earth. Their armor gleamed with holy purpose. Their weapons hummed with energies that his ancient senses recognized as genuinely dangerous. For the first time since arriving in this universe, he faced opponents who might actually be capable of harming him. "You will comply," Stern repeated, taking a step forward, his force weapon beginning to crackle with psychic lightning. "Or you will be destroyed." The Witch-King's response was to draw his Morgul blade, the sword hissing free of its scabbard with a sound like wind through dead trees. The Grey Knight's psychic hoods flared in warming. Brother Librarian Hyperion staggered as his warp sight touched the weapon and recoiled from what it showed, a blade forged in darkness before their Imperium existed, blessed by a dark lord whose malice operated on principles their training had never encountered. "Captain," Hyperion said urgently, "that weapon it's not demon-forged, but it's wrong. It's the Witch-King struck first, moving with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something undead." His blade carved through the air towards Stern, and the Brother Captain's force weapon came up to block. The two blades met, and the observation deck exploded with conflicting energies. Psychic lightning warred with necromantic cold. The viewport cracked from the pressure. Several lesser grey knights were thrown back by the shockwave of their clash. Stern felt the impact like a physical blow, his armor's servos straining as he pushed back against the Witch-King's strength. The creature was stronger than a normal human, though not as strong as an Astartes in Terminator plate. But there was something behind the blow beyond mere physical force, a weight of will and ancient malice that pressed against Stern's psychically reinforced mind like a knife seeking gaps in armor. "Purge it," he commanded. The Grey Knights opened fire with practiced discipline. Storm bolters roared, filling the air with blessed ammunition specifically designed to tear apart demonic essence. Incinerators belched holy flame that had reduced greater demons to ash. And from the librarians came focused lances of psychic fire, pure thought given destructive form. The Witch-King vanished in the center of a firestorm that would have obliterated a minor demon prince. When the smoke cleared, he still stood, his armor scorched and cracked in places, but his form intact. The Morgul blade remained in his hand, its edge undimmed. And from the empty darkness of his helm, a sound emerged, not quite a laugh, but something close, something that suggested this was the first challenge he had genuinely enjoyed since arriving in this universe. The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in the Grey Knight's extensive records of demonic combat. The Witch-King fought with a style that was simultaneously ancient and completely foreign, sword techniques that predated the Imperium by millennia, combined with sorceries that operated on principles their psychic training couldn't counter. His blade found gaps in ceramite that shouldn't have existed, corrupting the blessed metal wherever it touched. His mere presence caused frost to form on weapons and armor, mechanisms freezing and servos seizing. But the Grey Knights were far from helpless. They had faced demon princes and greater demons, had battled in the heart of the warp itself and emerged victorious. Brother Librarian Hyperion wove wards of pure faith, creating barriers that the Witch-King could not easily pass. Brother Sergeant Castian's force halberd caught the Witch-King across the chest, and for the first time, the entity staggered, his form flickering like a poorly tuned hololith. The weapon's psychic blessing was acting like poison to whatever unholy energies sustained him. The Witch-King felt genuine pain for the first time in centuries, not physical pain, for his undead form was beyond that, but something deeper. The Grey Knight's purity, their absolute faith, their psychically charged weapons, all of it was anathema to the curse that kept him bound between life and death. It wasn't destroying him, but it was weakening him, making his form less stable, his power less certain. He recognized the sensation from his distant past, from encounters with the elven weapons of Gondolin, from the blessed blades of Numenor's kings. Holiness, true and genuine, was one of the few things that could hurt what he had become. Brother Captain Stern pressed the attack, his force weapon carving through the air in patterns that were both martial technique and ritual banishment. "You are not demon," he said, his voice strained with effort and confusion. "But you are unholy. You are an abomination before the Emperor, and you will be cast out." The Witch-King parried, countered, struck back with precision born of 3,000 years of combat experience. But he was giving ground, slowly but inevitably, pushed back by the combined assault of warriors who had literally been created to fight entities like him, or close enough to him that their training applied. His Morgul blade caught another Grey Knight across the arm, the corruption spreading through the ceramite, but Stern's answering strike carved a line of burning pain across the Witch-King's shoulder, the psychic fire eating at his form like acid. For a moment, both sides paused, assessing the other. The Grey Knights had lost 3 brothers, their essences cut from their bodies by the Morgul blade in ways that prevented their genocide from being recovered. The Witch-King's armor was cracked and leaking the unnatural cold that sustained him, his form less solid than it had been. They were match different, but equal, locked in a stalemate that could only be broken by complete commitment from one side or the other. Brother Captain Stern made his decision. "Fall back to sanctified ground," he commanded. "We'll establish a containment zone, and no." The word came from the Witch-King, spoken in Gothic that was now fluent, learned through some dark mechanism from the minds of those he had fought. "No more." He raised his left hand, and power gathered around it, not warp energy, not psychic force, but something else, something that the Grey Knight's wards and protections were not designed to stop. It was the Black Breath, the Nazgûl's terror made manifest, but focused and controlled rather than exploded outward. He pointed at the damaged viewport, and the crack in the armored glass widened, reality itself seeming to flinch away from his gesture. "Go," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of ancient kingship. "Tell your Imperium, I claim no allegiance to chaos, I serve no dark gods, but neither will I bend to you." Brother Captain Stern stood frozen, his tactical genius warring with his religious duty. They could push this fight to its conclusion, could probably destroy or banish this entity with enough sacrifice. But it would cost lives, might cost the entire ship, and there was no guarantee of success. And something in the entity's bearing, in its cold dignity, suggested that it spoke truth. It was not of chaos, even if it was clearly not of the Emperor. "We will be watching," Stern finally said, lowering his weapon fractionally. "If you turn to the ruinous powers, if you threaten the Imperium or its citizens, we will return. And next time, there will be no quarter given." The Witch-King inclined his head, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or mockery. Then he turned back to the viewport, dismissing the Grey Knights as if they were no longer worth his attention. It was an insult, and Stern felt his brothers bristle at it, but he raised a hand to forestall any rash action. They had learned what they needed to know. This entity was dangerous but not unbeatable, hostile but not immediately threatening, and most crucially, not allied with chaos. As the Grey Knights withdrew, Brother Librarian Hyperion paused at the threshold, his psychic sight still fixed on the Witch-King. "Captain," he whispered, "I can see his past, fragments of it. He's not from this universe, he's not even from this reality, he's from somewhere else, somewhere our lore has no record of." Stern considered this for a long moment. "Then he is the Ordo Xeno's problem, not ours," he decided. "Let them puzzle out what to do with an entity from beyond reality itself. Our duty is to the demon, and whatever he is not that." The Blade of Titan disengaged from the Eternal Penance 2 hours later, leaving behind a detailed report and a clear warning. The entity aboard the Black Ship was to be considered extremely dangerous, possibly Xenos in origin, and under no circumstances should be provoked without overwhelming force. The report would wind its way up through the Inquisition's labyrinthine bureaucracy, gathering annotations and addendums, until it finally landed on the desk of an Inquisitor Lord who specialized in the truly inexplicable. The Witch-King remained on the observation deck, watching the stars turn slowly in the void. He had been tested and found wanting against true holiness. The Grey Knight's purity had hurt him in ways nothing else in this universe had, but he had also proven that he could fight them, could hold his ground, could earn a stalemate rather than immediate destruction. It was knowledge worth having. And as he stood there in the darkness between stars, he began to formulate something that might have been called a plan. If plans could be forged from ambition and malice and the cold certainty that this universe, like Middle-earth before it, would eventually learn to fear the name of the Witch-King. The Conclave of Shadow met in a chamber that did not officially exist, aboard a space station whose location was classified above top secret. 12 Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus sat in a circle, their faces hidden by shadows and hololithic distortion, their identities known only to each other and the Emperor himself, or so they believed. They were the foremost experts on demonic incursion and warp-borne threats in the entire segmentum, and they had gathered to discuss a single prisoner. The entity recovered near the Cadian Gate, currently contained aboard the Eternal Penance under maximum security protocols. Inquisitor Lord Covenant spoke first, his voice distorted by a vox modulator to prevent identification. "We have reviewed all reports from Captain Drusus, from Sister Karenina, from Brother Captain Stern of the Grey Knights. We have analyzed psychic recordings, examined physical evidence, and consulted every relevant text in our archives. And gentlemen, ladies, I must confess something I have never said in 40 years of service. I do not know what we are dealing with." The admission hung in the air like a curse. Inquisitors were not supposed to be uncertain. They were the ones who provided certainty in an uncertain galaxy, who categorized threats and prescribed solutions. But the Witch-King defied every category they possessed. Inquisitor Helena, specialist in demonic physiology, activated a hololithic display showing the entity's form rotating in 3 dimensions. It registers as material. It has mass, volume, occupies space, but it possesses no biological functions. No heartbeat, no respiration, no neural activity, no metabolic processes whatsoever. By every measure we have, it is dead. Yet it moves, speaks, fights with skill and intelligence. In medical terms, it is a living corpse. But that phrase doesn't capture the reality. The warp signatures are even more confusing, added Inquisitor Throne, whose psychic sensitivity was legendary. It has a presence in the immaterium, but it's not psyker activity. It's more like psychic residue, the way a room retains the smell of incense after the censer is removed. Something powerful shaped this entity, but whatever that power was, it doesn't match any warp phenomena in our records. Not chaos corruption, not demonic possession, not even Xenos psychic manipulation. It's something else entirely. The hololithic image zoomed in on the Witch-King's blade. The weapon is equally anomalous. Inquisitor Helena continued. Its composition includes materials unknown to the Mechanicus. When we attempted to analyze fragments recovered from combat, the metal literally decayed in our instruments, as if it couldn't tolerate being measured. The tech priests believe it might be forged from some form of solidified curse or negative emotion, but that should be impossible outside the warp. Inquisitor Lord Covenant leaned forward, his augmented eyes gleaming in the chamber's dim light. There is one other factor we must discuss. The entity's apparent immunity to both demonic corruption and standard methods of execution. We shot it, burned it, exposed it to null fields and sanctified ammunition. The Grey Knights engaged it with blessed force weapons. All of these caused damage but not destruction. And when we used melter-fire to reduce it to component atoms, it reformed within seconds. This suggests we are not dealing with a physical being at all, but rather a manifest curse or magical construct. Magic! Spat Inquisitor Karamazov, the purest of the group. There is no magic, only warpcraft and the Emperor's holy light. This thing is clearly demon-touched, regardless of what our instruments say. I recommend immediate immolation via cyclonic torpedo, cleansing both the entity and the vessel that harbors it. That was attempted, metaphorically speaking, Covenant replied dryly. The melter fire should have achieved the same result. The entity returned. Then we launch it into a star. And if it walks out of the star? The question silenced Karamazov, which was itself remarkable. Inquisitor Lord Covenant pulled up another set of data psychic impressions gathered by the astropaths who had survived proximity to the entity. Several psychically sensitive individuals have reported visions, for lack of a better word. They see fragments of the entity's past. A world unlike ours where the warp does not exist, where humanity is different. Less powerful perhaps, but also less burdened. They see a figure offering rings of power, a war that lasted for ages, a final battle where this entity's master was destroyed. Metaphor, suggested Inquisitor Throne. Psychic impressions often translate abstract concepts into narrative form. Perhaps. But consider, what if it's literal? What if this entity truly is from another reality, one with different fundamental laws? That would explain why our methods fail. We're trying to destroy something using rules it doesn't obey. The conclave fell silent, contemplating the implications. If the entity was extra-universal in origin, then it represented a class of threat the Imperium had never faced before. Demons were dangerous, but they were known. Chaos was terrible, but it was understood. This was genuine uncertainty, the kind that kept Inquisitors awake at night. Inquisitor Helena brought up a new document. There is one more troubling aspect. We attempted to contain the entity in a tesseract labyrinth pocket dimension designed to trap demon princes indefinitely. It walked out after 3 hours. When the tech priests examined the labyrinth, they found it was still intact and sealed. Somehow the entity simply wasn't there anymore, as if it had never been placed inside. That should be impossible, Karamazov protested. The Tesseract Labyrinth is warded by the Emperor's own servants. Nothing escapes it. And yeah... Covenant's voice was grim. Gentlemen, ladies, I believe we are facing a paracausal entity, something that exists partially outside the normal chain of cause and effect. Its resurrection after death is not regeneration or reformation. It's more akin to reality correcting itself, insisting that the entity exists regardless of what we do to it. In metaphysical terms, we cannot destroy it because its existence is enforced by mechanisms outside our universe's physical laws. The enormity of that statement settled over the conclave like a shroud. They were inquisitors, they dealt in absolutes, in purges and sanctions, in the definitive removal of threats. But how did one purge something that reality itself insisted must exist? Inquisitor Throne raised a pale hand. There is one other possibility. We could weaponize it. The suggestion was met with immediate protest from the purists, but Covenant raised a hand for silence. Explain. The entity has demonstrated hostility toward demons. Its mere presence caused them to deteriorate during the warp storm. Its blade corrupts their essence in ways that prevent reformation. If we could somehow direct it, aim it like a weapon toward the Eye of Terror or the Great Rift, it might serve as an effective counter to chaos incursions. You're suggesting we ally with an abomination, Karamazov said flatly. I'm suggesting we be pragmatic. The entity has shown no interest in serving chaos. Indeed, chaos fears it. If we could negotiate terms, it will not serve. The voice came from a 13th figure, one who had been present but silent throughout the entire discussion. The others turned, surprised and wary. The figure stepped forward into the light, revealing the skull-faced helm of a Deathwatch chaplain. I have spoken with it, briefly, during one of the containment transfers. It is bound to no master now. It will not bend its knee to the Imperium, not for threats or promises. Then what does it want? Covenant demanded. The chaplain's skull-helm turned to regard each inquisitor in turn. I asked it that very question. It told me it wants what it has always wanted, dominion. Not over specific territory, but over fear itself. It wants to be recognized as a power in its own right, something that even empires and gods must acknowledge. The conclave exchanged glances, a mixture of horror and reluctant understanding spreading through the chamber. They were dealing with something that had ambition, intelligence, and the power to back both. Something that could not be killed, corrupted, or contained. Something that would become a major player in galactic affairs whether they approved or not. Then our options are limited, Covenant finally said. We cannot destroy it. We cannot contain it indefinitely. We cannot corrupt or convert it. And according to our chaplain friend here, we cannot negotiate with it on terms favorable to the Imperium. So what do we do? Asked Helena. Covenant was silent for a long moment. We let it go. We monitor it from a distance. We prepare contingencies for when or if it makes its move towards some form of power base. And we pray to the Emperor that it remains hostile to chaos. Because if it ever turns toward the ruinous powers, if it ever finds common cause with them, we will face a threat that makes demon princes look like minor nuisances. That is cowardice, Karamazov protested. We are inquisitors. We do not back down from threats. No, Covenant agreed. We recognize when a fight will cost more than we can afford and when tactical retreat is the only sensible option. This entity has already survived everything we've thrown at it. How many ships are you willing to sacrifice, Karamazov? How many battle brothers? How many sectors would you see burn in the effort to destroy something that might not be destroyable? No, we document it, we classify it as an omega-level threat, and we establish monitoring protocols. And we hope. The vote was called. 8 inquisitors sided with Covenant. 3 sided with Karamazov. 1 abstained. The decision was made. The Witch-King would be released not freed in any friendly sense, but simply no longer actively contained. A beacon would be attached to his armor, one he would likely remove but which might give them a few days of tracking data. And the Imperium's vast intelligence apparatus would be tasked with watching for any signs of his activity. As the conclave dispersed, Inquisitor Lord Covenant remained in the chamber, staring at the hololithic image of the Witch-King still rotating in the air. "What are you?" he whispered to the image. "What did your universe make you into that our universe cannot unmake?" There was no answer, of course. Only the silent rotation of the figure in the light, its empty helm staring at nothing, its blade forever frozen mid-swing. A monument to the Imperium's limitations, to the boundaries of their understanding, to the terrible truth that even in a galaxy of horrors, there were still some things that defied all classification. The Witch-King would be released at the edge of the segmentum obscurus, far from major imperial holdings, but close enough to the eye of terror that his movements could be tracked. And every inquisitor, every ordo, every branch of imperial intelligence would be watching, waiting to see what this paracausal nightmare would do when given freedom in a galaxy built for war. They would not have to wait long. The planet had no name in imperial records, only a designation: Perdition's Edge, located in the contested space where the Eye of Terror bled into real space. It was a world of ash and ruins, its original inhabitants long since consumed by chaos or fled into the void. Now it served as a battleground where demons and mortals clashed in pointless skirmishes that echoed the greater war tearing the galaxy apart. When the Witch-King arrived, drifting down from the warp like a falling star, wrapped in cold shadow, both sides paused their eternal conflict to watch. He had spent weeks wandering the borderlands between reality and madness, testing his newfound freedom, learning the geography of this strange new universe. The Imperium's tracking beacon had lasted exactly 14 hours before he removed it and cast it into a star. Since then, he had been a ghost, a rumor, a cold wind that blew through Imperial outposts and chaos-held worlds alike, observing but not yet acting. He had been patient for 3,000 years. He could afford to be patient a little longer while he learned. But Perdition's Edge changed his calculations. Here, in this blasted landscape of broken cities and twisted reality, he sensed an opportunity. The warp was close here, close enough to touch without fully crossing over. Demons manifested easily, their forms more stable than in real space but less permanent than in the immaterium itself. It was a liminal space, a threshold between worlds. And thresholds, as the Witch-King had learned long ago in Middle-earth, were places of great power. He began his work in the ruins of what had once been a cathedral, its statues of the Emperor now cracked and defiled by chaos worshippers. The demons sensed him immediately. This was their territory, after all, their border realm between their home and the material universe. They came to drive him out, a swarm of lesser entities led by a demon prince of Te Sin Te, a creature of impossible angles and shifting futures who believed it could outwit this strange intruder. The battle was brief and instructive. The Witch-King stood in the cathedral's nave and spoke words in the black speech of Mordor, words of binding and command that Sauron had taught him millennia ago. But here, in a universe where words had literal power if backed by sufficient will, the spell did something it had never done in Middle-earth. It reached into the warp and pulled, not to summon demons, but to claim them, to wrap them in necromantic cold and Morgul sorcery that predated the chaos gods themselves. The demon prince screamed as its essence was invaded by something utterly incompatible with its nature. It tried to retreat back into the warp, but the Witch-King's will held it fast, pulling it down into the material realm and binding it there with chains forged from pure malevolence. The lesser demons fared even worse, simply came apart, unable to maintain cohesion under the assault of necromantic power. Others were twisted, their warp forms corrupted in ways that violated the fundamental nature of chaos itself. When it was over, the Witch-King stood surrounded by the writhing remains of his enemies, and he felt something he had not experienced since Sauron's fall. Possibility. In Middle-earth, his power had been limited by the ring that bound him, by the will of his Dark Lord, by the fundamental nature of his curse. But here, in a universe where the immaterium could be touched and shaped, where demons were real and permanent rather than distant myths, his ancient sorcery found new applications. He reached down and touched the demon prince's broken form. Instead of destroying it, he reshaped it. The Morgul curse that kept him between life and death extended outward, wrapping around the demon like a cocoon. When he released it, the creature that rose was no longer a servant of Te Sin Te. It was something new, a demon whose essence had been overwritten by necromantic command, whose loyalty was enforced not by worship or fear, but by the same curse that bound the Witch-King himself. It was, in effect, a Nazgûl, not the Nazgûl of Middle-earth, but a dark reflection of them, adapted to this harsher universe. The demon wraith stood before its new master, its form flickering between states of being, no longer fully of the warp, but not entirely material either. The Witch-King looked upon his work and found it acceptable. If he could not return to Sauron, if he could not reclaim his place among the Nine, then he would forge new Nine. Better Nine. Stronger Nine. He would become not a lieutenant but a sovereign of darkness in his own right. Over the following weeks, Perdition's Edge became a laboratory of blasphemous creation. The Witch-King hunted demons across the blasted landscape, selecting only the strongest and most cunning. Greater demons learned to flee from his presence, recognizing that capture meant something worse than banishment or death. It meant transformation, the fundamental rewriting of their essence into something that served the cold malice of an entity who predated their gods. He bound a bloodthirster and stripped away its rage, replacing Khorne's fury with the calculated violence of a cursed knight. He caught a great unclean one and purged its diseased joy, leaving only the patient inevitability of decay. A keeper of secrets fell into his hands, and he removed Slaaneş's ecstasy, leaving behind only the cold hunger for power. A Lord of Change was perhaps the most difficult, its ability to see futures and possibilities making it hard to trap, but when he finally bound it, he turned its scheming genius toward a single purpose: the expansion of his new dominion. One by one, he forged his new Nine, each one a masterpiece of dark sorcery, each one a violation of the natural order so profound that the Chaos Gods themselves took notice. Khorne raged at the theft of his champion. Nergal mourned the loss of his beloved creation. Slaaneş felt genuine anger, a rare emotion for the Prince of Pleasure. And Sintay, ever the schemer, began to calculate whether this development might actually serve his unknowable plans. But their anger meant nothing. The Witch-King had learned from his battles with the Grey Knights and his wanderings through the warp. The Chaos Gods were powerful but not omnipotent. They were bound by their own nature's Khorne's rage, Tzinti's complexity, Nergal's acceptance, Slaaneş's excess. They could not comprehend something that operated outside those parameters, something that was motivated purely by cold ambition and the desire for dominion. And that incomprehension was his shield. The warp around Perdition's Edge began to change. The constant flux and chaos that characterized regions near the Eye of Terror started to crystallize, to freeze into patterns that felt ancient and terrible. Demons who ventured too close found themselves moving through air that felt like frigid water, their forms becoming sluggish and uncertain. The Chaos God's influence began to wane in this small pocket of space, not replaced by order, but by a different kind of disorder: the cold, calculated malice of a being who had spent 3,000 years learning to rule through fear. Imperial observers, watching from their hidden monitoring stations, sent increasingly alarmed reports back to the Inquisition. The entity they had released was establishing a territory, something that should have been impossible for a single being in a region dominated by chaos. But the reports were accurate. Perdition's Edge was becoming something new, not an imperial world, not a chaos stronghold, but a third thing entirely. A dominion of cold darkness, where an ancient king from another universe was beginning to build what might become an empire. And the Witch-King, standing in his ruined cathedral surrounded by his new Nine, felt something he had not felt since the days before Sauron's fall. He felt purpose. In Middle-earth he had been a servant, powerful but ultimately subservient to a greater will. Here, in this grim darkness of the far future, he had the opportunity to be something more. Not a Dark Lord in the style of Sauron. That role was already filled by the Chaos Gods, and he had no desire to compete with them directly, but perhaps a king of a different sort. A sovereign of fear itself, a power that stood apart from the Imperium and Chaos alike, acknowledging neither emperor nor god. His new Nine knelt before him, their forms stable now, the Morgul curse binding them as surely as the rings had bound the original Nazgûl. Through them, he could sense other demons, could reach out across the warp and touch minds that had never known anything but the service of chaos. He could corrupt them, reshape them, add them to his growing force. It would take time, years, perhaps decades. But he had eternity. The curse that bound him guaranteed that, if nothing else. The Witch-King raised his Morgul blade above his head, and frost spread across the cathedral's walls, beautiful and terrible. In the distance, both Imperial and Chaos forces watched his rising power and made their calculations. Some would seek to destroy him. Others would try to use him. All would learn to fear him. And in a galaxy where war was eternal and peace was forgotten, that fear would be the foundation of something new. He was the Witch-King of Angmar, and though Angmar had fallen and Middle-earth was lost to him forever, here in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, he would build something that would make even that ancient kingdom seem like a pleasant memory. A realm of cold terror. A dominion of eternal night. And when it was complete, when his power was established beyond question, even the Chaos gods would look upon his works and acknowledge that something terrible and new had entered their galaxy. The reports reached Holy Terror 15 months after the Witch-King's release, delayed by the vagaries of warp travel and the bureaucratic labyrinth of the administratum. By the time the inquisitorial conclave reconvened to discuss the growing threat, Perdition's Edge had become something that defied easy classification. It was not a demon world, yet demons dwelt there in corrupted forms. It was not an imperial holding, yet it maintained a strange stability that Chaos worlds never possessed. It was not Xenos territory, yet it was clearly hostile to human rule. It existed in its own category, and that alone was enough to terrify those whose job was to maintain order in an already chaotic galaxy. Inquisitor Lord Covenant reviewed the intelligence reports with mounting dread. 17 demon-hunting parties had been sent into the Witch-King's territory and failed to return. 3 Chaos warbands had attempted to reclaim the region and were found weeks later, their warriors frozen solid, their Chaos mutations locked in place like statues. An Imperial reconnaissance force from the nearby Cadian Gate had observed from a distance and reported phenomena that made no sense. Warp storms that moved with purpose and intelligence. Demon packs that moved in disciplined formation rather than chaotic swarms, and at the center of it all, the Witch-King himself, standing in his ruined cathedral like some dark prophet from a forgotten age. The administratum wanted to declare exterminatus and be done with it. The military commanders wanted to send a full battle group to crush this threat before it grew larger. But Covenant, who had spent more time studying the Witch-King than anyone else in the Imperium, knew that neither solution would work. You couldn't bomb something that could resurrect from annihilation. You couldn't crush an army that included demon princes reshaped into something even Chaos couldn't fully control. This required a different approach: containment rather than destruction, monitoring rather than engagement. But containment was becoming harder by the day. The Witch-King's influence was spreading. Not rapidly, not with the explosive growth of a Chaos incursion, but steadily, inevitably, like frost creeping across a window. Worlds on the edges of the Eye of Terror reported strange phenomena: temperatures dropping without explanation, shadows growing darker and more defined, and whispered rumors of a king who wore no crown but commanded absolute obedience nonetheless. Most concerning were reports from psykers, who described feeling a presence in the warp that was neither demon nor human, neither chaos nor order, but something else entirely. Something old and patient and utterly certain of its eventual victory. The Chaos gods, too, were reacting. For the first time in millennia, they found themselves in agreement on something. The Witch-King represented a threat that transcended their usual conflicts. Khorne wanted him destroyed for the insult of stealing his champion. Tzeentch wanted him controlled for the possibilities his existence suggested. Nurgle wanted him assimilated into the Great Cycle. Slaanesh wanted him, well, Slaanesh's desires were as always complex and disturbing. But all four agreed that he could not be allowed to establish himself as an independent power. Yet their combined efforts failed. Greater demons sent to eliminate him returned corrupted or did not return at all. Warp storms directed at his territory somehow dissipated or froze into strange patterns that looked almost decorative. Chaos sorcerers who tried to curse him found their spells returning to them twisted and inverted, their own malice turned back upon themselves. The Witch-King had learned the rules of this universe's dark powers, and he had found the loopholes ways to exist that neither Chaos nor the Imperium had anticipated. On Perdition's Edge, the Witch-King stood at the highest point of his ruined cathedral, looking out across a landscape that was slowly being reshaped by his presence. The ash storms were subsiding, leaving behind a world of dark stone and perpetual twilight. His new 9 stood in a circle around him, silent and eternal, each one a masterwork of blasphemous creation. Through their connection to the warp, he could sense the vast scope of this galaxy, millions of worlds, trillions of souls, all locked in an eternal war that made Middle-earth's conflict seem like children's games. He understood now why the Chaos Gods were so powerful here. In Middle-earth, evil had been personal, embodied in Morgoth and then Sauron, individual beings with individual wills. But here, evil was conceptual, archetypal, the dark reflections of emotions that every sentient being felt. That made chaos almost impossible to defeat. You couldn't kill an emotion, couldn't banish a concept. But it also made chaos predictable, bound by the very archetypes it embodied. And predictability was a weakness he knew how to exploit. His own power was different. He was not a god, not a demon, not an archetype. He was simply himself, the Witch-King, the cursed king from another universe, carrying with him sorceries and principles that this galaxy had never encountered. That made him weak compared to the Chaos God's raw power, but it also made him flexible, unpredictable, capable of moving in ways they couldn't anticipate. He was in essence an anomaly, a glitch in the system. And glitches, properly exploited, could bring down entire systems. He had no illusions about conquering the galaxy. That was a fool's dream, the kind of grandiose ambition that had destroyed Horus and would eventually destroy any who attempted it. The Imperium was too vast, chaos too eternal, the Xenos races too numerous and strange. But conquest was not his goal. Never had been, even in Middle-earth. Sauron had wanted to rule all things. The Witch-King had only ever wanted to be feared by all things. And in a galaxy already drowning in horrors, creating new fear required innovation. His plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. He would establish himself as a third power, independent of both the Imperium and Chaos. He would offer refuge to those who fled from both heretics who rejected Chaos but could not return to the Emperor, Xenos who sought temporary alliance against greater threats, even demons who had grown tired of their god's capricious nature. He would build not an empire but what was the word these humans used? A state. A polity. A recognized power that had to be negotiated with rather than simply destroyed. It would take centuries, perhaps millennia. But he had time. Oh, did he have time? The curse that bound him guaranteed his eternal existence, and in this universe where warp travel made time itself uncertain, eternity was not the burden it had been in Middle-earth. He could be patient. He could wait for the right moments, exploit the right opportunities, make the right alliances and betray them at the right times. He could play the long game in ways that these short-lived humans and even the immortal Chaos Gods could not anticipate. And if he succeeded, if he truly managed to establish himself as a recognized power in this galaxy, then perhaps, just perhaps, he would have achieved something that even Sauron in his prime had never managed, not conquest, but acknowledgement. Recognition as something that must be reckoned with, respected even in hatred, feared even by those who thought themselves fearless. The Witch-King turned to his 9, and though none of them had faces anymore, only the cold emptiness of cursed existence, he knew they understood. They were extensions of his will now, perfect servants in ways the original 9 had never been. Through them, he would reach out across this galaxy, touch minds and souls and promises. He would whisper in the right ears at the right times. He would be the option that desperate people chose when all other options had failed. He would be the cold hand extended in the darkness, offering survival at a price that seemed reasonable until it was too late to refuse. In the Imperium, a new name began to appear in classified documents and whispered briefings. Not his true name, few in this universe knew it, but the titles and epithets that terrified soldiers and inquisitors gave him. The Silent King, the Undying One, the Cold Sovereign, the Wraith Lord of the Warp. Each name carried its own legend, its own warning, its own terrible promise of what happened to those who crossed paths with the being at the center of perdition's edge. Among the Chaos warbands, those who survived encounters with him spoke of the Unbound, the demon who served no god, the power that Chaos could not claim. Some foolish champions sought him out, believing they could corrupt him or win his allegiance. They were never seen again, though occasionally their warbands would receive deliveries, frozen statues of their former leaders, preserved in perfect detail, their expressions locked in eternal realization of the mistake they had made. And in the warp itself, where the chaos gods brooded over their domains and schemed against each other, a new factor entered their eternal calculations. A piece on the board that moved by its own rules, that could not be captured or controlled, only avoided or accommodated. Cincy found it fascinating. Khorne found it infuriating. Nurgle found it melancholic. Slaanesh found it intriguing. But all four agreed on one thing. The Witch-King of Angmar, whatever else he was, had become a permanent fixture of their reality. The galaxy turned, and war continued as it always had. But now, in the shadows between the great powers, in the spaces where neither Emperor nor Chaos held absolute sway, something new was growing. Not hope, this universe had precious little of that. But possibility. The possibility that power could exist without worship, that strength could manifest without corruption, that fear itself could be refined into something approaching sovereignty. The Witch-King stood in his cathedral of ice and shadow, his Morgul blade gleaming with cold light, his new 9 arrayed around him like the pieces of some vast and terrible game. He looked out across the galaxy he had inherited by cosmic accident, this grim darkness where war was eternal and peace was forgotten. And in the empty space where his heart had once beat, where his humanity had once resided before the rings and the curse and 3,000 years of undeath, something that might have been satisfaction took root. He was no longer Sauron's lieutenant. He was no longer merely one of 9. He was the Witch-King, undying and unbound, a sovereign of terror in a universe built for monsters. And in this age of endless war, where even hope had learned to scream, fear itself would be his crown, his throne, his eternal dominion. Let the Imperium plot. Let chaos rage. Let the Xenos scheme and the galaxy burn. He had walked through the void between universes and emerged unchanged. He had stood before chaos gods and rejected their offers. He had faced the Emperor's finest and fought them to a standstill. Nothing in this universe could claim him, nothing could contain him, nothing could end him. And that, more than any army or weapon or dark sorcery, was what would make him legendary. In a galaxy where everything could be conquered or corrupted, where every soul had a price and every power had a weakness, there existed one entity that simply refused to be anything other than what it was: ancient, terrible, patient, and free. The Witch-King of Angmar had entered Warhammer 40K. And the grim darkness of the far future would never be quite the same.